You have paid taxes your entire life. So did your parents. So did their parents. So did every farmer in ancient Egypt, every merchant in Babylon, every soldier in Rome. Taxes are older than money itself, older than writing, older than organized religion as we know it. They may be the single oldest institution in human civilization, and yet, most people have no idea where they came from. No idea that taxes once built the pyramids, that they forged the Persian Empire across 3 continents, that the corruption of Roman tax collectors is literally referenced in the Bible, and that in one ancient society, the wealthy actually competed with each other to pay more. Today we are going back to the very beginning, because to understand how money, power, and civilization are connected, you first need to understand the story of taxes. And it is a far darker, stranger, and more fascinating story than anyone ever taught you in school. To understand where taxes began, you first need to forget everything you know about the modern world. Forget the separation of church and state. Forget elected governments. Forget central banks. In the ancient world, the ruler was God, not a representative of God, not chosen by God. The ruler was God. In Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, and across Mesoamerica, the pharaoh, the king, the emperor, they were divine, which meant that paying taxes was not merely a legal obligation. It was an act of worship. The earliest taxes came in 2 forms: labor and tithe, because money, as we understand it, did not yet exist. You paid with your body and your harvest. Labor tax first. Almost every free man in ancient society owed months of physical labor to the state each year. This is how the pyramids were built. This is how the great temples rose. This is how city walls were raised and canals were dug. In ancient Babylonia, ordinary people had a name for it: the burden. Sound familiar? The tax burden, a phrase 5,000 years old. And just like today, those with money found ways around it. The wealthy sent slaves, they hired substitutes, they bribed officials. Proper identification barely existed, so sending someone else and claiming it was you was remarkably easy. Tax avoidance is not a modern invention. It is as old as taxation itself. Then came tithe, a portion of everything you produced: grain, livestock, oil, cloth, handed over to the state. In Mesopotamia, governments quickly discovered they could tax almost anything, and they did. Virtually every transaction, every harvest, every trade, all of it subject to some form of extraction. The collection itself was ritualized, sacred, bound up in ceremony and religious obligation. To refuse was not just illegal, it was blasphemy. By the time of the Persian Empire, taxes had evolved into something far more sophisticated, something that would reshape the ancient world entirely. At its peak, the Persian Empire stretched from Libya in the west to what is now Pakistan in the east, an area so vast that no army alone could hold it together. No military presence could maintain loyalty across that distance. What held it together was a tax system. The Persian rulers divided their empire into royal domains, territories governed by local administrators who ruled on behalf of the Shahanshah, the King of Kings. In return for their loyalty and their service, these administrators received a portion of the local tax revenue they collected. Persia had just invented one of humanity's most powerful governing technologies: the bureaucracy. But this was not just about collecting money. The tax system funded a network of roads, rest stations, and supply points that stretched across the entire empire. State messengers could travel thousands of miles. Military contingents could be resupplied. Information could move faster than any rival power in the ancient world. Taxes were not just revenue. Taxes were the nervous system of the empire. Control the taxes, and you control the territory. As empires rose and fell on the power of divine rulers, one civilization took a completely different approach, one that turned the entire logic of taxation upside down: ancient Greece. In most Greek city-states, there was no concept of regular taxation. None. Citizens were not subjects to be extracted from. They were participants in a civic project. And that fundamental difference in philosophy produced a tax system unlike anything the ancient world had seen. The primary tax, called the esphora, was applied only to the wealthiest citizens. and it was only levied in times of genuine crisis, war, famine, catastrophe. Even then, a wealthy citizen had the legal right to refuse it on one condition. They had to identify someone richer who was not being taxed enough. The burden could be legally transferred upward, not downward, never downward. Athens went further with a tax called the liturgy, applied only to the wealthiest fraction of Athenian society. It funded public projects too large for any single citizen to bear: warships, temples, gymnasiums, public theatrical performances. The cultural life of Athens, funded by the voluntary competitive generosity of its richest citizens. And here is the part that should genuinely stop you. The wealthy of Athens did not merely accept the liturgy, they competed to pay the most. Donating the largest sum to a public project was a mark of honor. It was social status, cultural prestige, civic glory. The richest men in Athens argued, publicly, over who had given more to the city. A society where paying taxes made you admired, where wealth was validated by public generosity rather than private accumulation. It lasted for centuries, and it produced one of the most extraordinary civilizations in human history. And then, we come to Rome, the empire that turned taxation into an industry, and that industry into corruption, and that corruption into collapse. Ruling a vast empire was expensive. Maintaining a professional army across dozens of provinces required a constant flow of revenue. But the Romans faced a fundamental problem. Rather than build a state tax collection system, they outsourced it. They hired private tax farmers. The state set an official tax rate. But these private collectors, they were free to collect as much as they could above that rate and keep the difference. You can already see where this is going. Tax farmers across the Roman provinces extracted far beyond the legal rate. When grain harvest came in, they bought up supply at low prices, then held it back until shortages drove costs sky high, and sold it back to the same people they had taxed. Then they loaned money to citizens who could no longer afford basic food, at ruinous interest rates. They taxed the poor, they hoarded the food, then they loaned the money back at interest. And they did it all legally, under Roman law. It is not a coincidence that tax collectors appear repeatedly in the Bible, consistently grouped alongside sinners. In the provinces of Roman Judea and across the Near East, the tax farmer was not just a bureaucrat. He was the face of empire, the face of suffering, the face of everything wrong with power. And what did Rome do when its own people could no longer bear it? It added more taxes. It reintroduced land taxes on Italian citizens, abolished for centuries. It imposed new tolls on commercial trade. It even granted universal citizenship across the empire, not out of generosity, but to expand the tax base, citizenship, as a revenue strategy. By the final decades of the Western Roman Empire, something extraordinary happened. When foreign invaders began pushing at Rome's borders, many ordinary citizens did not fight back. Some actively fought alongside the invaders, because the invaders could not possibly be worse than their own government. At least the barbarians hadn't taxed them into the ground. Step back and look at the full 5,000-year arc. Taxes began as religious tribute, the price of living under a god-king. They became the architecture of empire, the Persian bureaucracy that held 3 continents together. They evolved into civic philosophy, the Athenian experiment where wealth was honored through generosity, and they collapsed into systemic corruption. The Roman tax farmers who extracted so much that citizens welcomed their empire's destruction. The pattern is consistent across every civilization, every era, every geography. When taxes are used to build, they create the pyramids, the Persian roads, the Athenian temples. When taxes are used to serve the people who pay them, they produce some of the most extraordinary flourishing in human history. When taxes become a mechanism for the powerful to extract from the weak, empires die every single time. The Romans didn't fall because of barbarians at the gate. They fell because the people inside the gate had stopped believing the empire deserved to survive. That is the deepest lesson in the entire history of taxation. A government that taxes its citizens without serving them does not simply create economic hardship. It destroys the one thing no empire can survive without: the consent of the governed. Agriculture started civilization. But taxes shaped it, and they are still shaping it, right now. If you made it to the end, you now understand something that connects ancient Egypt to your last payslip. Drop A in the comments. That is how I know you stayed until the very end. And if this changed the way you think about money and power, subscribe. Because every week on this channel, we follow the money through history. And it always leads somewhere surprising. Next, we go deeper into one of history's most powerful financial dynasties. You will not want to miss it.